thank you so much to everyone for attending what might be an early morning session, depending where you're joining us from. And it was really wonderful to hear from Mike and from Mark as well in the introduction about the importance of maintaining the benefits of trees and also how that intersects with urban density and private property as kind of the final frontier in urban forestry, which are all topics that I'm going to try and touch on today in my talk. And so before I start, I'd like to acknowledge a whole bunch of people who contributed to the work that I am going to be presenting today. That includes a number of funding agencies and local partners, as well as co-authors on the papers I'll present. And some of the work I'll present goes back to my PhD a few years ago. So thank you to really wonderful lab mates and co-authors from Wisconsin. And I'd also like to give a special shout out to Casey Trees, who actually provided a fellowship that got me started in urban forestry several years ago. So it's especially nice to be talking about this work at this particular venue. And thank you as well to all of my really wonderful students from my current lab at Concordia, where, as Coulter mentioned, I run a landscape ecology lab in our biology department. So I'm experimenting a little here in this talk with Frankensteining together a few different pieces of my research life, from my own work as a student to new projects that are being led by my students today. And all of our work in the lab really focuses on what I like to refer to as the ecological fabric of our cities. And so by that, I mean all the little bits and pieces of green space distributed throughout our city, from our nice big parks to our restoration areas to our own yards, gardens, vacant lots. And we use fieldwork and synthesis approaches to try and ask how we can better understand and ultimately how we can better manage these spaces to support both biodiversity conservation, so provide a home for our non-human neighbors in the city, but also ecosystem service provision. So in other words, can we actually assess, map, quantify some of those benefits that Mike Riley talked about in his introduction? Another, maybe oversimplified way to think about my research program is that cities, or more accurately, the people who live in cities, need nature. So we ask questions like, how can we manage our urban trees and forests to reduce hot summer temperatures? How do neighborhood greening projects benefit the surrounding community? On the other hand, nature also needs cities, or more accurately, nature needs us to manage cities with other species in mind. So I won't talk quite as much about this today, but we also think about how biodiverse are our cities? How does the way we manage green spaces influence organisms like wild pollinator communities? And although we study many aspects of the urban environment, I'm going to admit to this particular audience that trees are my favorite. And luckily for me, trees play a particularly important role in shaping the ecological fabric of our cities. More specifically, at least in the temperate cities that I tend to study, today I'll talk about some work from Madison, Wisconsin, and from Montreal in Quebec. Trees do a better job than almost anything else when it comes to improving our urban spaces. Because trees are so large, they contain so much volume and biomass compared to other types of vegetation, they provide an incredible range of benefits, from cooling our city streets through to promoting physical activity, managing stormwater, reducing stress, and improving mental health. And if you look online or maybe in other talks, you've probably seen all kinds of infographics like this that share the benefits of urban trees. And it's this incredible ability to provide benefits that motivates me to study the trees in our cities. So if we can do a better job of measuring and mapping these benefits, we can provide guidance to make our cities safer, healthier, more livable places. So part of what I do in my research what many of my colleagues do in their research is to try and do an improved job of measuring and mapping these benefits so that we can inform the decisions people make about trees on the landscape. So, what I'm planning to do today is give you a few kind of in depth dives into how we do this kind of work as scientists. How do we come to these conclusions about the benefits of urban trees? And I'll talk a little bit at the end about how these trees are distributed throughout our cities and who is responsible for their management. And I'm going to start by talking about cooling, which is something I focus on a lot. And I would actually argue that 2 to 4 degrees here is kind of a low estimate of the power trees have to reduce city temperatures. I think there's even more potential there. And if we're going to talk about temperature regulation by trees, the logical place to start is, why we need that temperature regulation in the first place, which relates to, in part, the urban heat island. Urban heat island describes the higher temperatures we find in cities. In the city, we pave over green space, we increase the density of roads and buildings, we tend to reduce vegetation, and all of this alters the energy budget relative to surrounding areas like rural or natural areas. You don't need to understand energy budgets or biophysics to be familiar with this phenomenon, though, because it's something I bet most of you have experienced firsthand. Think about standing in a parking lot on a really hot summer day compared to standing, in a forest or a field. And while an extra few degrees might not seem like such a big deal, especially as we get into fall and temperatures drop, um, this is actually really important from a human health perspective. So in the US, heat related deaths outpace all other mortality due to extreme weather, or at least they did a few years ago. I think that's still true. Uh, High urban temperatures also increase energy use, air pollution, cause a whole host of other issues for the people who live in our cities. Meanwhile, our cities are growing more crowded and hotter as climate warms and urbanization continues. And this is a worldwide issue. Even, up here in Canada, which many people think of as a particularly cold country, we are facing significant increases in urban heat. For example, if we go to our beautiful Canadian climate atlas here, we can see that Montreal, where I live, historically, at its baseline, 70s, 80s, 90s, when I was growing up, would have about 8 days per year over 30 degrees Celsius. 30 degrees Celsius is high 80s Fahrenheit. And by the time I retire from my new job, we will have 50 days of the year over 30 degrees Celsius, most of our summer days, in fact. And we actually had record breaking heat just a couple of weeks ago. I should have updated my article here that I'm showing. Now, of course, this isn't a new problem. We've known about the urban heat island for a long time. We've recognized this as a problem since before I was born. But much of our research has focused on these urban-rural differences. So the difference between the hot city and the cool surrounding area. So how do you beat the heat if you live in that hot city? And that's where we're increasingly focusing research these days. Now, if we come back to this article, I want to point out the rest of this quote that I read. And that's the rush to act is actually ahead of the science. So decision makers really want to cool cities down, but the best ways to do this are still somewhat unclear, partly because much of our research has focused on those urban rural differences. So in the city, you know, what do you plant? How much do you plant? What about green roofs? What about other solutions? There are still a lot of questions here. This doesn't mean we can't start acting, but it does mean that the science has to keep up. And this is partly because even studies within cities often focus on what we might call the park cool island effect. So, how do the size and shape and distribution of larger green spaces like parks affect air temperature? Now, these park cool islands are really important. It's important people have access to these spaces. But simply adding larger or differently shaped parks to an existing city is obviously a huge challenge. We're working with the cities we already have. And beyond that, we know that urban heterogeneity, that the structure of our cities encompasses so much more than this dichotomy between built up areas on one hand and parks on the other. We have all kinds of in between areas. So, to improve climate adaptation in strategies, we need a better understanding of how temperature varies at the scales at which most of us live. And studies have started to address this. So there's some recent studies of land surface temperature, for example, using satellite data, have shown remarkable temperature variability at micro scales, going from homes and roads through to yards and parks. But we still have a lot further to go to make this link with air temperature, and from there with health and other impacts. So, my colleagues and I wanted to think about how fine scale changes in land cover might affect air temperature, an important metric for public health. And we did this in Madison, Wisconsin. This is work we started probably about 5 years ago now, although only wrapped it up recently. And so Madison, if you haven't been, is a mid-sized city in an urbanizing, agricultural area. It's similar to many temperate cities throughout the US and Canada. And fortunately, we had a really great baseline to work with, as work done by my colleagues shows that we do have a distinct urban heat island in Madison. You can see that here. So Madison is between two lakes, which are these black blobs that you see. And this image comes from interpolating, from kind of connecting the dots between 150 of these stationary sensors, and is based on the percentage of impervious cover. So based on how much hard paved surface we have and the temperature of these sensors, we're able to estimate our heat island at a pretty coarse scale. And we built on that broader scale work to think about local scale mitigation, particularly by the urban forest. And the reason I look at trees is that the urban forest is always changing. It's actually quite difficult to replace pavement, or build an entire new park. We do it sometimes, but we can adjust the tree cover we have in existing landscapes a little more easily, although also slowly. And in many cities, we decide how that happens, right? We decide whether to treat or remove trees in response to invasive insects. We decide on policies for tree replacement. Um, we decide where and what kind of new trees are planted in our cities. We being a broad term, right? Different people are making these decisions, and we're going to get into that a little bit later when we talk about governance of the urban forest. But all of this means that decisions we're making today may be dictating future temperatures. And these are decisions people really care about as well. So, as I was doing this research, I noticed a resident in my own neighborhood had put little signs on our trees talking about urban forest policy, which trees might be replaced with what. And so, people are obviously engaged in this issue. So, this is shaping the heat riskscape of the future. And one of our key questions here was how canopy interacts with impervious cover to alter air temperature. And we know the hottest and the coolest ends of this spectrum already, right? We know the forests are going to be cool and the parking lots are going to be hot, but the overlap is not addressed as often. This kind of nuance is really hard to tease out with categorical sampling. So, for example, if I put a sensor in a park versus a sensor in a dense neighborhood, we might miss the middle ground that makes up most of the city. So, how do you catch that middle ground? How do you actually measure urban air temperature at a fine scale while capturing spatial change in multiple explanatory variables? So, we want to know how canopy is changing, how impervious is changing, where the water is. And in my case, uh, I got really creative with my bicycle. So, this is essentially a weather station. Every second, I can record the temperature, the solar radiation, the GPS coordinates, which are saved to this data logger. It's all hooked up to a motorcycle battery. Um, and this corresponds to a measurement about every 5 meters spatially. Uh, For those of you who are curious, I'm happy to talk more about the actual components of this or share examples of other folks who have built something similar. And this kind of mobile sampling, I mean, it looks really silly, right? You're riding your bike around with this wonky weather station on the back of it, but it's actually an example of how new technology, new methodology is innovating the way we do urban research. So stationary sensors are excellent for characterizing kind of broad spatial patterns or looking at change over time. But mobile sensors can capture all that fine scale variation, and we can access areas that might otherwise be hard to study quickly and efficiently. And we can see that this kind of mobile sampling is gaining traction. So this is a paper that was just out, this summer by my colleague Mike Alonso, I believe actually in DC, where some of you are based, and they used vehicle-based mobile sampling to look at the effect of the urban canopy. So I think we're going to keep seeing a lot more of this kind of science. And so we sampled 10 transects throughout the city multiple times each during the hottest part of the day. And then we did four of them at night as well. I'm going to focus mostly on the daytime data today, but I'll sneak in just a few short nighttime results at the end. And I'm just going to zoom in on one example here today, this one over here, because I think the raw data is actually really compelling. So you can see from this satellite image, we can ride from, a dense forested park with a dirt path, no pavement, through to a really, high canopy part of a neighborhood, maybe getting into more typical neighborhoods, but still with good tree cover, out into what we might call suburbia, through to like the shopping mall parking lot. And so in the space of just a few kilometers, we can span different combinations of canopy and impervious cover. Now I'm going to color this line using data from one of my sample rides, where the temperature ranged from about 27 to 31 degrees, or about 81 to 89 degrees Fahrenheit. And it's going to start over here, where you can see as I'm riding through the city, we're seeing a pretty dramatic change in temperature. So these fine scale changes on the landscape, this took me maybe 15 minutes to bike ride through, and we're seeing these large changes in temperature, air temperature that we can measure. But this is one bike ride out of about 85 that I did that summer. So how do we actually quantify patterns across 150,000 individual measurements? As mobile sensors become cheaper and easier, we're seeing a rise in this sampling technique, including campaigns to get citizens out, mapping temperature data with their bikes and cars. But the resultant data can be pretty tricky to deal with really well. So I'm going to go through a series of steps fairly quickly here for how we dealt with this data in our study. And the first step was that we calculated a temperature anomaly for each measurement, which is the temperature at a given location, so wherever I am riding, relative to a set reference location at the same time. This was from a set of in situ sensors. So this accounts for any background temperature change while we're biking, allows us to compare data from different days. Because our reference is in the hot inner city, you'll see a lot of these temperature anomalies. The data I show you later will be negative. So how much cooler was it where we were compared to right downtown? And then we looked at what was surrounding each measurement. And so for each point we were riding, we could see how much canopy cover was in that area, how much impervious cover was in that area, using data sets at a 1 meter resolution. So we were lucky to have really great high resolution data. And we also took into account the distance to the nearest lake, since we know that can have a cooling effect. And Madison is a very lake centric city. And we did this at multiple scales. So 10 meters, that's about the size of, one downtown lot, through to 30 meters, 60 meters, 90-meter radius. That's about the size of a city block. So these are very kind of human scales, the kind of scales we live and move around at. We used generalized additive models as a flexible approach to model these relationships. So if you're interested in the stats of this, I'll run through it quickly. If you're not, this won't take long. So the models included all those things I talked about, our canopy, our impervious, distance from the lake. We also took into account the spatial structure of the data and the fact that we had done multiple bike rides along multiple transects. And the nature of this kind of high frequency mobile data means there is also residual temporal autocorrelation. So measurements you take really close together are more likely to be similar to each other. So to account for that, we split our data into 100 different models where we took model 1, 101, or sorry, point 1, 101, 201, and then the second point, 102nd point, and so on. So we're never actually using data points from right next to each other in the same model to account for that unique structure. And then we average those to give us our predictions. So these are all just ways of taking into account that this data it's a big data set, it's a messy data set. We want to really treat it properly to pull out the real effects. And so this is the fun part. We're going to look at some results. And so I'm going to show you these relationships for the effects of impervious cover down here on the bottom, canopy cover here on the top, for each of those 4 scales. And we're going to start with impervious cover. So this is what we usually use to base our heat island models on. And as you would expect, air temperature increases as you pave. So as you pave your landscape, it gets hotter in a pretty consistent fashion. At larger scales, this effect is larger. So if you were to pave your whole neighborhood, you would increase your temperature, in this case by about 1.5 degrees. Now, what happens when we add canopy to the mix? And so canopy has a cooling effect, as we might expect. But there's a couple things I want to point out here in these graphs. And one is that at each scale, the magnitude of temperature change was greater with changes in canopy than impervious surfaces. So for example here, increasing from no impervious up to 100% impervious gave us about a 1 degree increase at the scale of, I think it was about a 60-meter radius that I'm showing you here. In that same area, if you were to increase your canopy from 0 to 100, you could cool that area by 1.5 degrees. So at local scales, we actually can offset these increases in heat from urban infrastructure if we can get enough canopy on the landscape. The other really important thing that we found is that this relationship was non-linear, particularly at larger scales. And so we really have to get past this threshold of about 40% canopy cover before we really see these strong temperature drops. This is something that a few other studies have now found with air temperature as well, that we often do tend to see these nonlinear effects where, planting a few trees, you might not accumulate a large effect right away, but eventually you can tip yourself into these bigger impacts. And so putting those trends together, we can look at that whole space between canopy and impervious. So here we have increases in canopy, and here we have, oh, that's wrong. Here we have increases in impervious where my mouse is, and here we have increases in canopy. And all these little black points are somewhere in that space where I had a measurement. So my bike covered that really, really well. And I'm just showing you the scale here. So you can see what I want you to focus on here is the gradient in colors. So at 10 meters, at the scale of your own property, no matter what you do with impervious cover and canopy cover, you can manipulate the temperature a little bit, but only by 1 degree or so. Now, as we increase in scale to 30 meters, to 60 meters, now we're seeing over 2 degrees of variation. To 90 meters, about the scale of a city block, we're seeing differences of over 2.5 degrees. We're seeing a broader range of colors here. This is Celsius, with these differences in fine scale land cover. This, of course, is an average across many days with different weather conditions. If I were to show you just the clearest, hottest days when health and energy impacts are most consequential, we would see the largest differences. This difference is also just as big, or in some cases bigger, than the differences we see between the city and the surrounding rural region. Now you'll notice that there's no black points up in this corner. So why did we miss that space? And that's because you can't really have 100% impervious cover, but also 100% canopy, right? As we increase our urban density, we do have less space for trees, which is a challenge for sure. So what happens at night? Canopy substantially moderated the effect of impervious cover on daytime temperature, but the reduction of impervious surfaces is really critical for reducing nighttime urban heat islands. So at night, we saw a lot less variation in this space due to changes in canopy. So we found more of an effect on air temperature during the day at these small scales. So knowing this, what does this information tell us, practically? Where do we actually plant trees? So first, pushing neighborhoods over that 40% is where we'll see the greatest benefit. Of course, we can't reach that target everywhere, right? In some neighborhoods, we simply don't have the space to reach 40% tree canopy. So that strong and really nonlinear effect of canopy suggests that we need some balance, some consideration in our urban planning and design between a more compact urbanization that we know has a lot of benefits and leaving a little bit more space for these trees. It also means we need to think about creative solutions in some of these dense areas where we can't reach high canopy thresholds. And that's something we're thinking about a lot in the lab these days. Now, we did see that local planting was still effective. It was just a lower effect than if we had more surrounding canopy. And that means that we need to think carefully about where we plant these trees and really target planting in the areas where we think it will have the most effect or the most importance. So are we planting trees where people are, living and walking and waiting for the bus and playing? And are we encouraging collective action so that if we plant trees, in a coordinated way, we can reach some of these higher canopy levels? And I really want to highlight here that it's critical that we don't use this kind of information to default to a rich get richer approach to urban forestry. We know that urban forest cover often follows patterns of structural inequality and systemic bias in our cities. So this, if you haven't seen this infographic or this paper from Chris Schell, it's a really excellent paper that looks at the effects of structural racism and classism that perpetuate through our urban landscapes. And so if we only focus on areas that already have high canopy to push them over a threshold, we're going to perpetuate existing patterns rather than doing the work we need to correct these patterns. So we can't forget low canopy areas. To me, what this information tells me is we need to get all of our neighborhoods up to a higher threshold of canopy. And I hope that Dr. Kanayandike later talks about his urban forestry rule that he's proposed, that we should see 3 trees from our window, 30% tree cover in every neighborhood, and live 300 meters from a park. Because I think this actually lines up very well with what we're finding here, that it's this local neighborhood scale canopy cover that has really influential effects over urban heat. Now, I want to clear up a few questions here preemptively that I often get asked about this work. And the first is, does the type of trees matter? Does the biodiversity of those trees matter? And I did say I would talk about biodiversity today too. So if we have a really nice lush canopy like this, do we have to worry about the species? Uh, and the answer here is maybe. So we still have a lot to learn about the intersection of tree diversity and the benefits those trees are providing. So there is some work, not much yet, but there is some work showing that species diversity can actually increase the magnitude of urban cooling effects. And of course, there are other ecological studies showing that diverse species can increase ecosystem function, generally. So that's a future direction for us in the lab. And this is my student, Matt, who's an undergrad in the lab, who actually just a couple weeks ago recreated a bike sensor here in Montreal to do some tests of forest diversity in the future. Of course, another point that I think is really critical is the role of diversity in sustaining our urban forests. So we only have to look as far as the emerald ash borer to understand that without diversity, our forests are at risk. So I love this example. I mean, I don't love it. I wish the trees were still alive, but I find this a very illustrative example of this effect where this particular street in 2006 and 2009 really shows the dramatic effect that planting a single species can have on our landscapes. And I also really appreciate this piece here from my Quebec colleagues, including Alain Paquette, highlighting the importance not just of species richness, but thinking about functional diversity of our forests as well. Are we planting, different types of trees? So we talked a little bit about where we should plant and what we should plant, but is planting even enough to begin with? Everybody loves tree planting because tree planting sounds great. It sounds very actionable. It sounds much more impressive to plant a tree, in fact, than to simply not cut a tree. And we do need to plant trees, absolutely. But just as we've started talking about in non urban areas, the maintenance and retention of healthy trees is critical to preserving the benefits of our urban forests, and particularly preserving our urban forests today. If we plant trees now, we're investing in our future, and that is absolutely important. But we also need to keep the large trees that are providing more of these benefits now. And this becomes especially important when you think about how hard it can be to keep our urban trees alive and thriving. We know the city is a hard place to grow up for a tree. And so if we can keep the trees that are healthy, that are living now, we will do a lot of good. So the last thing I want to think about from this particular work before moving on to a quick snapshot of a new project is who is actually responsible for all of this tree planting or tree preserving anyway. And I want to show you a simple illustration here. So let's just take a look at an example of a residential area. This is in Madison where I did that temperature sampling, but this could be in a lot of cities. This is a nice high canopy area. We have lots of space for trees. I'm just highlighting the canopy here. But canopy is also governed by multiple stakeholders. So throughout this talk, I've been saying, we should plant this, we should do this. But who is that we? And in this case, what would this neighborhood look like without the contribution of private landowners, without these residential trees? And it would look not quite so green, right? If we take out the trees managed by individual people, by you and me, we lose a lot of that canopy cover. So surpassing 40% canopy or 20% or 30% canopy, whatever our target is, at the scales that many people live and work is really unlikely, probably impossible if we don't consider both public and private contributions. Urban climate adaptation requires an all hands on deck approach. So, land governance, who takes care of our land, can have a really significant influence on the livability of our cities. And this is just an example of one neighborhood I pulled from Madison, but we know that this high proportion of private trees holds across many cities. So here's an example from Toronto, but I could show you examples from other places in the US and Europe. And here, private property owners control 60% of city trees. And I couldn't get this idea out of my head as I was finishing this work that private trees are so important and we know so little about them. We just don't have the same kinds of data. Even a number like 60% is something that doesn't exist in many of our cities. And so I was really pleased when I started my position here in Montreal a couple of years ago. I realized I saw this article in the paper and I realized my colleague and now my collaborator, Alain Paquette, over at the Université du Québec à Montréal, or UCAM, was thinking about these same issues, really trying to understand private trees in the city. So, for example, to read a quote from this article, most cities do inventories of the number and types of trees that the municipality is responsible for, but public trees account for only about half the trees growing in cities. There is no firm data on the types and number of trees private citizens or institutions have planted. Now, as a scientist, when you see something like no firm data, I mean, that's an obvious place to direct some research, right? Let's collect some data. And I was so happy to hear Mark in the introduction today talk about private property as the final frontier. I think that's absolutely true. And so here we can see a great example of what Alain was talking about in that article, where this is a piece of Montreal's public tree data set. And this looks quite comprehensive, right? There's a lot of trees there until you zoom in and you see what's missing. And we can see that, all of these backyard trees here, including trees, on campuses, churches, schools, are not inventoried. Now, we work with partial data sets all the time as scientists and decision makers. We work with samples of data. We don't collect, every piece of information. We try and collect a representative piece. So if we only have half of city trees, is that such a bad thing? Half the trees actually seems like quite a lot. But I think this really depends on whether those public trees are actually representative of the broader urban forest. So, are the trees in our parks, in our street right of ways that we have in these municipal data sets representative? Are they indicative of places like private yards, like institutions, where our choices about what to plant might be very different? And this question of how representative our public tree data was really intrigued master student Kaylee Hutt Taylor, who's just wrapping up her master's thesis in my lab now. And she wanted to understand, what was actually out there if we looked more comprehensively at our trees. And so we developed a sampling plan to go out and knock on some doors and measure trees across a variety of land use types, including people's yards. And this was in early 2019, and she was so excited to start her first field season. And of course, COVID 19 shut the city down about a month before she was supposed to go out and sample. So, like many grad students, she quickly regrouped, and we decided that if we couldn't go door to door to collect data, maybe some of that data could come to us. People are interested and knowledgeable about their trees and want to share that information. And so what she did was she launched something she called the NDG Tree Project. NDG, or Notre Dame de Grâce, is a large neighborhood in Montreal. And so she combined a traditional field inventory, so going out and actually assessing, measuring trees in accessible places like schoolyards, like parks, updating our municipal tree data set. She combined that with a community science project where she would collect data from private yards across the neighborhood. So we talked on the radio, we got on Facebook, we sent out flyers, and we said, "Hey, please send us measurements and photos of your backyard trees that we can verify and add to this inventory." And she had almost 100 responses over the summer, about 800 trees on private land, combined with 600 trees on public institutions. So she collected residential contributions from across the neighborhood, but focused on a smaller sample plot to assess parks, street trees, public institutions. So we had 7 parks, thousands of street trees, 16 public institutions, and almost 100 yards. And so pulling all of this data together, this is still a work in progress, but a snapshot of what we're finding so far. We can see here, this is a plot of the species richness. So as we continue to add samples, as we keep adding parks and yards and more data, we see increases in the species richness that eventually kind of plateau once we've captured everything that is there. And you can see here that this blue line representing private yards has a higher species richness than any of the other land use types. This is across the whole neighborhood. And so parks and institutions and street trees have a similar species richness, and our private yards are surpassing that. And if we look at the actual raw data that Kaylee collected 30% of the tree species in her data set were only found on private land. Private land also, I'm not showing this data here, but private land tended to have, and yards in particular, tended to have a higher number of native individuals, native trees, which was a great project done by an undergraduate student this year. And this is important because we know that native trees can play a critical role in supporting wildlife like insects and birds in our cities. Private land also had a much larger proportion of coniferous trees that we tend to find are lacking in our public data sets in Montreal. And so it's not just richness, the number of species that's different, but some of the traits or the characteristics of these species as well. Now we can also look at tree size. And so here we're just seeing this curve represents the the distribution of DBH, of diameters of these trees. So here where you have this kind of high peak and this blue line, for example, which is our private yards, it means most of our trees are small. And up here, this purple line, which is our street trees, you can see that most of our trees are actually quite large. And so even though private yards tend to be more diverse, they also have smaller trees. Most of our large trees, the trees that might be providing a lot of these benefits like temperature regulation, carbon storage, flood control, tend to be planted on our streets in our right of ways. So what this is telling us is that different pieces of the landscape, areas that are governed in different ways, we're making different decisions about, actually do differ, which means the data sets that we're using might not be fully representative of the trees that are actually there. And the next step for Kaylee's work is digging into some of the traits of these trees to tell us something about the ecosystem services provided by different types of greenscapes. So if we look at traits that relate to cultural choices like, fall color or flowering or bark texture, or we look at traits that relate to regulating services like the size and growth rate of our trees, can we understand something about which pieces of the landscape are providing us with which benefits? And maybe by having these different species in different places, we're actually getting more benefits overall when we look across the city. This project is growing. So we have now established 3 plots in Montreal, at UQAM, at Concordia, and this summer at Dawson College. And these are all based around institutions so that this work can be integrated into teaching and undergraduate research. And along with the Paquette Lab, we're working on establishing a network in the future to expand to other cities as well. So if this seems like something you want to integrate into a class or a research project, stay tuned. We will have more information about this in the coming years. So what have we learned from biking around the city and figuratively knocking on our neighbors' doors? First, going back to that first study of temperature regulation where we started, canopy substantially moderated the effect of impervious cover on local daytime temperature. But while urban forest management provided really high mitigation potential during the day, reduction of impervious surfaces remains really critical for reducing nighttime urban heat. So trees are wonderful. We should absolutely plant more of them, preserve them, but it's not a one size fits all solution to our complex urban problem. We can't just plant our way out of problems like heat entirely. And that strong and nonlinear effect of canopy suggests that we need some innovation, some balance in urban planning and design. And so at the very beginning, when I'm forgetting now whether it was Mike or Matt who said this, but they talked about, you know, urban density and how it's getting harder to plant trees in some of these really dense areas. And so while we need to strive for higher levels of canopy where we can, I think we need to investigate other nature-based solutions where we can't. So understand more about the effect of other kinds of greening in combination with canopy cover to provide multiple benefits. Spoken like a true researcher, I'd be out of a job if I didn't think that more research was needed here. Particularly, I think we need to do more to understand the generality of some of these findings. So I keep saying 40%. That's a number we found in Madison. In another city, maybe it's 30, maybe it's 25, maybe it's 50. And so the more research we do across cities, the better we'll understand how general these patterns are. And we also need to understand more still about the ecological mechanism. So which species are important? How do other aspects of these trees influence our findings beyond just cover? And part of that understanding will come down to collecting good, reliable baseline data of what our urban forests look like on the ground beyond just public trees. And perhaps most importantly, what I want to leave you with is that we have a lot of agency here. So you saw how important private yards or private land was for contributing to those high levels of canopy cover. We know that a large percentage of our urban species may only be found on private land. We know that our street trees might play an outsized role in providing benefits, so managing those is really important. This means that all of us, depending on our role, whether we are homeowners or whether we are associated with a school or a campus or whether we are making decisions for the city, have an important role to play in improving and maintaining our urban canopy. However, our influence is strongest when we work together. So collectively across land use types, across modes of governance, at broader scales. So from that, I will say thank you and leave you here. I have left some time here so that we can really get into some questions and discussion. I'm also very happy to have you contact me. You can see my email and my Twitter here if you prefer to follow up afterwards.
All right, great. Thank you so much, Carly. That was awesome. I really appreciate it. You gave us a lot of information there. This is really good. Um, Before we start with the questions, I have a couple questions from our audience. Before I do that, I just want to remind everyone that if you look in the chat box, we did put the links up for the landscape architect credits. So there's a link to the quiz. Fill that quiz out and submit it. All the other CEUs will be put into the chat box at the end of the summit after our third speaker. So Carly, I do have a couple of questions about your presentation.
Sure.
So Kit asks us, how would you prioritize city, county expenses for urban trees, keeping in mind keeping mature trees alive or creating pocket parks or planting new tree strips along our streets? So is there a prioritization of what should be prioritized?
Oh gosh, that's a great question. And my instinct is to say we need all of these things, but of course we do have limited budgets to work with. I think one thing I am not a budget person, but one thing I do think is really important is that we can't budget for planting new trees without also having a strategy for how we will keep those trees alive. So those two items have to go in tandem. I guess I would consider that I would prioritize those at the same level where if we're going to go out and do a big tree planting campaign, there needs to be some strategy for how we're going to take care of those trees, how they're going to be watered during their first years when they're very vulnerable, for example. And so I think keeping those in mind as not like two separate items, but as one item where rather than planting trees and maintaining trees, we consider those together. We plant and maintain.
Mm.
Creating more pocket parks has so many benefits beyond just the things I talked about today, like temperature, right? Especially in terms of giving people access to nature and access to green space. And so that's something that I think also I would certainly prioritize giving access to green space, particularly. So maybe another way to answer this, how would I prioritize expenses for urban trees? I would prioritize the areas that need them and the areas that have been maybe systematically disadvantaged in terms of the parks and the trees that they have. So making sure we're getting them to the people who need it most.
Okay, great. Um, so we have another question. So with the inventory you did did the private yards in Montreal contain more exotic species than the public lands?
Yeah, they actually didn't, and I thought they would. Our hypothesis here was that we were going to see this really high proportion of, so proportionally they didn't. If you looked at, our hypothesis was that they would, was that you'd see a lot of these exotic species that people are planting on their private lands. What we looked at in this data, and I wish I had the figures here for you, was, in each yard, what, or in each park or on each street, what was the proportion of native or non-native species? And it was about 50-50, close to that across all these land cover types. And it was actually, the proportion of species was very similar across, a park or a yard or a street tree. What we did find was that private yards, when we looked at the number of trees, the actual individuals, they tended to have more native species proportionally. So the opposite of what I had thought. And part of that is due to certain species that are very common. So for example, like cedar hedges, we see a huge number of native cedar trees in our private yards that can inflate some of these numbers. And so this is something that we're now hoping to actually look, now that we have these three different neighborhoods, we want to dig further into this question of native and non-native species and unpack those patterns a little bit more.
Okay, great. And I also had a question with the species on private land.
Mhm.
Were those generally smaller diameter trees versus large shade trees?
Yeah, absolutely. And so we found that on private land, we tended to have much smaller trees. And we looked at, so we weren't sure at first, is that just that their trees are newly planted and they haven't, grown into their mature size yet, or are they smaller statured trees in general? And so we looked at also the expected diameter at maturity of all the tree species we found in these different sites to tease that apart. And we found that in private yards, it wasn't just that trees were younger, it was that they were actually smaller statured trees, which makes sense, right? People are planting, small trees in small spaces. They're planting fruit trees, ornamental trees, things for aesthetics. And so we do tend to see more large shade trees along streets,
Mhm.
also in our parks.
Okay, great. Let's see. So how about using green roofs? Extensive and intensive and dense urban areas. Has that been studied in cities that you're aware of?
Yeah, this is a great question. And I get this question about green roofs every time I give a talk. And it makes me feel like I should be doing more research on green roofs, which I'm hoping to get into in the future. But we have done this in some cities. What we tend to find is that the benefits of green roofs in terms of temperature regulation are, they're there, but they're relatively low and relatively localized. And so the one of the major benefits is that you're removing that impervious surface. So you're removing these surfaces that are going to kind of capture and hold heat, but you're not getting the same amount of benefit as you would from a tree canopy. And that's partially, when you think about trees, they're giving us cooling in multiple ways where they are transpiring or evaporating water, kind of like little air conditioners.
Hmm.
And they're also providing shade to the land below them. And so green roofs, I think a lot of good can be done by green roofs. I think we need more research on the magnitude of those effects, but I don't think we're going to green roof our way out of this problem. We also do need the canopy.
Okay, great. Let's see. To build on the private property one, what strategies are effective at bringing private landowners into the process of maintaining, expanding the green canopy?
Yeah, so I think definitely processes that, or strategies that engage communities, engage neighborhoods are really important. And so in many cities, there are uh, community tree planting programs. For example, I'm thinking of in Montreal, there's a program called A Tree for My Neighborhood, where a group has greatly subsidized trees that you can buy to plant on your private land. There are similar programs in many cities. And so I think education is important, helping people understand, why to plant trees, which species may be beneficial, but also money, funding for trees, reducing the cost of planting trees for private landowners.
Okay, great. So here's a question about the data set you had. So does your temperature mitigation research take tree height into account? Any advice for neighborhoods planting new street trees on the value of shade trees versus understory trees?
Yeah, so this particular study did not take tree height into account directly. So we were just looking at the canopy covers. Like if you were looking down, how much canopy is there?
Okay.
But a big, tall shade tree is going to tend to have a much larger canopy, right? And so when it comes, so indirectly, yes, a tall shade tree is likely going to provide greater temperature mitigation benefits. Something that I'm really interested in now is when we have kind of multiple layers of structures, when we have shade trees as well as understory trees, how does that increase these benefits? You can
Yep.
imagine it might provide more overall volume of trees. So I think we
Yep.
do need both.
Totally. And so there's a question about like with the tree inventory on the private land,
Mhm.
and we're doing it by hand now. Do you foresee like any technologies in the future that will help us to get a more accurate and complete inventory of private land, trees on
Y-
private land?
Yeah, that's a hard one. That is something people are working on using like ground based or street level LiDAR, using some of these machine learning algorithms to try and identify trees. There are a couple of challenges there, and one is just the sheer number of species we have in cities. And so we often will have, Montreal has upwards of 200 species of trees. That makes it challenging, especially to pick out rare individuals.
Right.
And also, some of these trees are just physically difficult to see. They're behind fences, they're in areas. And so I think, yes, I think, 10 years ago or 10 years from now, we will probably have much better automated methods of doing some of this. In the
Mhm.
meantime, we still need a lot of kind of boots on the ground work, including to validate these methods. So, these methods we're developing that are more automated, we need good, high quality field data to make sure they're getting it right and to
Okay.
develop those.
Okay. Perfect. Yeah, I thought that was very interesting how you talked about not knowing what's on private land, and as we manage public land here, and just we know what we have, but we don't know what the whole area is. So that's a
Yeah.
very big missing piece.
And people are often really surprised by this, where they're like, oh, what do you mean we don't know which species are there? And I'm like, well, if you think about this, how would you get that information? You have to go into people's yards to collect it. And so it's just a challenge of them being so distributed and so numerous.
Yes, that is a challenge. That's pretty interesting. Let's see. I think I have time for a couple more. So does zoning need to be reconfigured in many cities or municipalities um, to accomplish what you're trying to do?
I don't think necessarily. I mean, I am not a zoning or a planning
Okay,
expert, so there may be
sure.
ways that zoning could help, but I do think with our current zoning, we can still plant trees. The key is reaching the right decision makers who are responsible for those zones.
Okay, perfect. Sounds good. Let's see. So here's a question about the lake. So do you think the presence of Madison's lakes affected temperatures in your study? And do you think the findings would be different in an environment without large bodies of water?
Yeah, so that's one I can answer because we did look at the effect of lakes, and there is an effect of lakes, but it's very localized. So if you're right next to the water, we did see a strong cooling effect. But as soon as you're, you know, maybe 20, 30 meters away from the lake, that effect really dropped off quite quickly in Madison. And so it is important if you're near the water, but it's not something that was affecting areas, in other parts of the city necessarily. Certainly something we need to account for when we're doing these kinds of studies because we know there's a local cooling effect.
Okay, all right, great. Well, Carly Ziter, that's about all the time we have, I think. We got to most of the questions too. So I wanted to thank you again for being here and sharing this information with us. And I hope to look forward to your research in the future.
All right. Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for all of the great questions that you asked. Lots of ideas for future research for sure.